addressing you on the referendum campaign for the voice to Parliament. I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people and bring greetings from Cape York. My address this evening will be to tell you the origins of this agenda. It started a very long time ago with my late mentor, Ron Caston, whom I first met when the High Court brought its decision down in June 1992. It was within a month or so that we met with Ron and Nellie in North Queensland to plan the next stage of native title, which was the Wick case in Cape York Peninsula. It was all about extending the native title decision to the Australian mainland. And Ron helped us settle the claim for the Wick people. And I immediately came into Ron's world, and he became a decisive legal and political mentor of mine, and I entered into the love of the Caston family. I then, after we launched the Wick case, and we won it in 1996, I have to say, 31 years later, we're about to finalise all of the native title claims on Cape York. We will settle title over 98% of Cape York within the next 18 months. So comprehensive land justice has been possible as a result of Mabo and the Wick case. I've been pursuing policies to strengthen and empower our people socially and economically, understanding that dependency would not be sustainable for us, that we have to rebuild our families, communities, and the society on Cape York. In pursuit of policies that are sometimes averse to progressive thinking. A few years into the 90s, I began talking with Ron, and Ron was always telling me, you have to pivot, you have to think about pivoting. The gains that you've made require you to start talking with the right about a settlement of these issues. And it led to a process that Nellie will well recall, called the Bennelong process, where we started engaging, particularly in the wake of the Wick decision and all of the national furor about it. We began engaging with the political and business right of the country and trying to seek common ground. And Ron facilitated that process. And it ended up with a lot of common ground with the right, some leading politicians, leading business figures from around the nation, who started to agree that we should have constitutional recognition and we should settle a treaty between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the rest of the country. The document that we signed off on at the time is extraordinary to reflect on in retrospect. Because here was a coming together of conservative Australia and leaders like Pat Dodson, myself, and a whole range of land council leaders who found common ground didn't proceed because the Howard government at the time did not want to compromise on the BIC, and therefore we had a brutal battle in 1998. However, I got taught by Ron an important lesson, and that is that there is common ground to be held with members of the Australian political right. And it was a lesson I learned from Ron. In the meantime, Ron invited me to visit Mark at ABL, where I would be offered a place at Arnold Lockleaf under Mark's tutelage, which I've enjoyed for 25 years now. And when we lost Ron, Mark and I continued the work, thinking about how we could secure common ground with the right. The basic thesis was that we needed Nixon to go to China on reconciliation. And so, having once been a darling of the left, I invited opprobrium from the left, my old friends, in seeking common ground with the right. The idea was that if we pitch a flag at around 4 o'clock on the political dial, everybody to the left of them should, in theory, follow. They should be easier to bring on board. And that partly was true. But I think I lost a lot of bark with the left and progressives who didn't understand what our strategy was. Mark and I worked through the 2000s trying to encourage John Howard to move on reconciliation. We had a meeting, you'll recall this, Melissa and Rob, that we had a meeting at the Hotel California at Port Douglas, where was really our first attempt to try and revive an agenda with seemingly never to lose power Howard government. To see if in the latter stages of his prime ministership we might have a chance to make progress. But it was hard. By then our Indigenous leadership were suspicious of Howard. They would have nothing to do with him, and they wouldn't come at any kind of rapprochement with him. Even though perhaps Mark in 2004 might have been our best chance, had we been more assiduous and moved with greater alacrity, we lost the opportunity in that after the 2004 election. Nevertheless, Mark and I kept working with the Howard government behind the scenes, trying to bring him to a position, and Mark was urging upon me the possibilities. And eventually, Mark and I secured the support of John Howard for constitutional recognition, leading into the 2007 election. And so the most cogent case in favour of recognition is actually Howard's election aid speech in the 2007 election. If you want to read the best case arguing the need and importance of recognition, it is Howard's speech in 2007 to the Sydney Institute. And in that speech, Howard intimated that he was seeking preambular recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. which would have been a rerun of his 1999 failed proposal that did not win the support of the Australian people for preambular recognition. I rang him literally an hour before he gave the speech because they had sent me an embargoed copy. And I said to Howard, this will not do. Preambular recognition will not be enough for Indigenous people. And there was great tension and anxiety and running around and everything else because he was about to give his speech. And he assured me at the time, well, we'll be able to talk about exactly what form of recognition he would run with in the event that he won the election. So that was a commitment I got from him, that he was not absolutely wedded to the preamble and that we would have talks following the election on a different model. Of course, he didn't win the election. And Kevin Rudd, who'd made the mirror commitment to Howard, just on election eves, told us that his recognition commitment would be put off to a second term. I was absolutely furious. But that was the case. I did not deal with the issue, and of course he never enjoyed the second term. It took Gillard, when she was Prime Minister, to eventually set up the expert panel, which Mark co-chaired with Patrick Dodson. And it was that expert panel that came up with 5 proposals for recognition that were delivered to the Parliament. And the central piece of which was a non-discrimination proposal, that there be a provision in the Constitution that would prevent discrimination. From all of the polling that had been done, it was the proposal that enjoyed bipartisan support amongst voters, Labor and Liberal, and Indigenous people, non-Indigenous people, supported the non-discrimination proposal. But we were met with such a wall of opposition from constitutional conservatives in the media who alleged that a non-discrimination proposal would be a one-clause Bill of Rights. So we were stonkered. And throughout 2012-13, we were stuck with a proposal that had immediately aroused vehement opposition amongst the political class and academics and constitutional conservatives. So we went back to the drawing board and decided to talk to constitutional conservatives, and went to a meeting with Julie and Lisa at the Australian Catholic University in Sydney, where we had robust conversations under the aegis of Professor Craven, the Vice-Chancellor, which resulted in the question, well, Julian, if you guys won't give us a constitutional guarantee against discrimination, what assurance can you give Indigenous people? What would you give other than that? And the answer was, well, why don't you have a democratic voice? Why don't you have a say about what Parliament's proposing? The constitutional conservatives told us that rather than going to the High Court to preside over a rights clause, why don't you have a say to the Parliament? was from that the Voice to Parliament idea arose. And Julian Lisa really was one of the people responsible for coming up with the idea. A group of us wrote to Prime Minister Tony Abbott saying that we had reached common ground on the Voice idea. And in fact, we began to feel that it was a better idea than the one we had originally proposed. And we found in discussions with First Nations groups and leaders that they were more interested in having a voice than having the High Court supervise a shield. They wanted the sword of a voice rather than the shield of a rights cause. So we first wrote to Tony Abbott in 2014, and he, amongst all of the bizarre things that have happened in those years, he responded to me with the idea, oh, it would be more simple to have Senate seats allocated. I remember on the side of the highway, shaking my head, saying, well, you think a voice is hard. Now you want us to fight a battle to get allocated Senate seats. He had just come back from New Zealand, where his wife is from. And he was enthused about allocated seats for Māori in New Zealand. And anyway, this whole story has a very long origin. It has an origin in Ron telling me to pitch the flag at 4 o'clock and to see what good can come from finding common ground with the most decent conservatives. Those conservatives that are prepared at the end of the day to do something decent. I don't think the Nixon needing to go to China rule was wrong. It was right. We would never have had, we would never be in this position today had we not convinced Howard. Mark, I have great belief. We first needed Howard to move on this, and we got him. And what must be remembered is that in every election since 2007, the political parties have had a commitment to constitutional recognition, including the Liberals. Every election over 5 parliamentary terms has had bipartisanship around constitutional recognition. And many in the Liberal Party are either not aware of that or willfully blind to it, or they have forgotten that. But the fact is, you look at the platforms over those 15 years, and there's always been a commitment to constitutional recognition by the LNP. Bipartisanship only fell apart after May last year, with the election of the Albanese government. Prior to that, every government had been committed to it, including the 9 years of coalition government. In fact, the Morrison government had set aside $170 million to conduct a referendum in the forward estimates. So this has been a bipartisan agenda, and every effort has been made by Indigenous leaders to make this bipartisan. Possibly one of the errors in retrospect from our point of view was that we kept making concessions ahead of the need to make them. knowing that a solution would require a concession. But unless they extract it out of you, they feel they gain nothing. Anyway, we pivoted several times in order to allay the fears of conservatives. We did the pivoting in anticipation of their objections. And we got no credit for it. And we ended up in a position where, basically Peter Dutton wanted us to postpone the referendum until after the next election. Having waited 15 years to reach this point, we were supposed to, in order to accommodate his political aspirations, put off the referendum until it was convenient for him to run it. And finally, that was not something that we could agree to. We're now 6 weeks away from the referendum we've been waiting for 15 years. No public policy issue has taken as long as this. No public policy issue in the history of this country has been the subject of more parliamentary processes, more public reporting, more inquiries than this one. And it's all for a pretty modest idea. Modest but profound. It will be extremely profound. I'm going to end my presentation with a very short speech about its importance. This referendum will test the proposition that a nation conceived in the fiction of terra nullius, a continent empty of owners, after a long failure to recognise the original peoples, can come to a new understanding of who we are, a nation blessed, with an indigenous heritage spanning 6 millennia, a British democracy captured in its constitution, and a multicultural unity that is a beacon to the world. The words enshrine the presence of peoples whose ancestors made this land their home for more than 60,000 years in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia. They make a constitutional promise only the Australian people can make. There shall be a body to be called the Voice. The purpose of the Voice is to make representations to the Parliament and the executive government on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. They grant Parliament the power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. Parliament creates and may alter the details of the Voice, but there will always be a voice. These words uphold the Constitution while recognising First Peoples, completing the 3 parts of the profound, unfolding and compelling story of Australia. If affirmed, this referendum will seize the last best hope for a lasting settlement. Our country will have a new birth, and the nations of the earth will learn that with justice, what remains wrong can be put right. And when people face the truth, they can open their hearts. And that it is never too late for reconciliation. Thank you.
Another thank you to Noel, not just for being here, but for sharing so clearly the journey that not just you have been on, but that this proposal has been on. And I don't for one second take for granted hearing all these stories and acknowledging the toll that this is taking, and we appreciate you being here. I also just want to take a minute to apologise on behalf of Adjunct Professor, the Honourable Kevin Bell, who was meant to be here moderating tonight, but he is unfortunately sick and apologises for not being here, but you have me. I'm about to call up at the rest of our panellists, and I just want to acknowledge the connection that they all have, and this has been quite a journey, and how special it is to have them all on stage together. So first we have Professor Melissa Caston. Melissa is a professor at the Monash Law Faculty and the director of the Caston Centre for Human Rights Law. Her family were new Australians, refugees from persecution in Eastern Europe, who came to Australia seeking safety and the opportunity to build their new lives in what they were told was a new nation. Melissa teaches and writes in human rights law and public and constitutional law, kind of relevant, and her research focuses on opportunities for the recognition and implementation of proper legal relations with First Nations people. Thank you, Melissa. And now, Mark Liebler, AC. Mark is Senior Partner at Arnold Bloch Liebler and Head of the firm's renowned tax practice. A passionate advocate for social justice and human rights, Mark and his firm have demonstrated a profound commitment to Indigenous rights and empowerment over 3 decades. In 2010, former Prime Minister Julia Gillard appointed Mark to co-chair the expert panel on constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, and in 2015 he was subsequently appointed by former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and opposition leader Bill Shorten to co-chair the Referendum Council, which culminated in the release of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Mark is also deeply involved in Jewish affairs, having occupied leadership roles in Jewish organisations in Australia and internationally. He is National Chairman of the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council, Life Chairman of United Israel Appeal of Australia and Governor of the Australia-Israel Chamber of Commerce. He is a patron of the Victorian chapter of Australian Friends of Tel Aviv University. Mark's service to the nation was recognised in 2005 with his appointment as a Companion of the Order of Australia. Please welcome Mark. Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Good start. Mark, I just wanted to first let you all know that we're hoping to get to audience questions, but we'll just see how we're going for time. But hopefully you can trust me with your questions and know that we want everyone to leave here feeling a little bit more empowered. We know there's a little bit of uncertainty and confusion happening, and we want you to all be able to feel confident in having conversations with people when you leave here. So that's how the questions have been framed. Mark, I'll start with you. We heard Noel talk about the journey that this proposal has been on. You were one of the few non-Indigenous people present when the Uluru Statement from the Heart was endorsed by delegates at the National Constitution Convention in May 2017. Can you describe what you observed and how it informed your passionate, ongoing support for the Voice to Parliament?
Can you hear me? Yeah. It was an amazing experience. I was there for 3-4 days during the course of the final convention, and I watched the Indigenous leaders going in and out of the various meetings, and I was invited not to the actual hall when the Uluru Statement of the Heart was adopted, but in a break because there were no non-Indigenous people invited. the actual meeting, but I was in a breakout room and I watched that final session when the Uluru Statement for the Heart was adopted by acclamation. And by the way, notwithstanding all this nonsensical discussion about whether it was 26 pages or 50 pages or 2,000 pages, I can tell you that what was adopted was, whatever you want to call it, the one-page statement that all of us know and understand to be the Uluru Statement of the Heart. That was the statement that was, in fact, adopted, nothing else. And I must say, it was, for me, it was a spiritually uplifting experience. I don't know how else to describe it. And then, of course, following that final session, I was invited to the closing session of the, you know, under Uluru, under the rock there. It was quite sort of something. And Professor Megan Davis actually stood there and read the statement, and I think it was Noel, Megan and Pat Anderson. We were presented with, in my case it was a shield, I think. I'm not sure what you got. No, you got a shield too. But I must tell you, it was an incredible experience. Let me just put it very simply. I was born here. I was born here. I was born in the Mercy Hospital. A long time ago, actually, almost. Well, I won't say. But I was born in the Mercy Hospital. And this has been an incredible country to grow up in and to be born into. It's been an incredible living experience. You know, I've had a sort of successful practice. Most of the people that I know have been very successful. This has been a wonderful country. If you, as a Jewish person, by the way, as a human being, you won't find a much better place to live in than Australia. And as a person of the Jewish faith, again, particularly today when you look around the world, setting aside Israel, where is it better for a Jewish person to live? But there's one, and it took me a little bit late in life to wake up to this. But eventually it struck me there is one shocking blot on this country, and that is the condition of our Indigenous peoples. I mean, the British came to this country, committed acts of murder, dispossession, generated intergenerational trauma, brought diseases against which those who had inhabited this country for 60,000 years had no immunity against. And notwithstanding all of the talk and all of the God knows how many millions of dollars spent on Indigenous affairs, of which I believe probably 90% went to white bureaucrats and 10% found their way to where the money should have gone. Notwithstanding all of that, look at the condition in which Indigenous peoples are today. And that's why, to me, this referendum, and it struck me right from the beginning. You know, I remember during meetings of the Referendum Council, I sat opposite the table from Noel, and I said to Noel, why is this so important? It's true, you're getting a guarantee of a voice, but really the reality is it's going to be left to Parliament to, you know, chop and change in terms of how it works and everything else. And he said something to me at the time which stayed with me forever. And what he said was, the importance of this is its political impact and its moral impact. if it's carried by a referendum of the Australian people. And by the way, that's why at Uluru itself, and it's something that came across to me very clearly, the Uluru Statement of the Heart is not directed at politicians. It's directed to the Australian people. And I remember there was discussions about that. It was decided politicians would not be invited to this, and they weren't. Sorry, I've gone on for too long.
No, that's a perfect point, because you mentioned that it's not political, and Noel, when you spoke about how up until recently there was bipartisan support for recognition. So, Melissa, I want to ask you a question. There's an idea that there is the principle of the voice, and then there's the idea of what the voice means. And there's a lot of people that appreciate the idea of recognition but are concerned about what they say is the lack of detail. Can you talk about why the proposed change in its current form is suitable for the Constitution, and generally what would you say to those people who say, if you don't know, vote no?
There was about 4 questions.
So let's start with one.
Start with the first one, which was the question of, is it correct to construct it in a way where you have a constitutional reform and you leave the detail for later on? And Noel has very handily left us all with a little business card for us to take away to read and look at very carefully. And in that little business card, you're probably sitting on it, there is detail here. And the detail part of this equation is where it says the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws to set up the voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. Now, it is... So believe it or not, talking about constitutional law is basically my favourite topic, and I can do this for an hour and a half without stopping or taking a breath, but I won't. It is completely normal when you have a structural document or a framework document that you have the broad principle in the framework and you have the detail and the machinery and the administration of that comes in a different document. If we make the mistake of putting too much detail into the constitutional reform, then everyone, as you can probably imagine, just nitpicks that every as was but. Every word just gets analysed to the point where people can't actually make sense of what's being spoken about. This is entirely clear and simple and straightforward, and it's just one amendment that goes in, so we're not putting lots of amendments into the Constitution, just one block of text. And the other thing that's proper about this is it leaves it up to Parliament next year or the year after, soon enough, to flesh out what the detail and what the proper construction of the voice should be. Now, they already have a report that was commissioned by the previous government by Professor Langton and Professor Karma, which had 30,000 different individual submissions and committees and representations to it, which sets out a very good example of what the voice advisory body could look like, how it could be composed, what its work would be, how people would be represented in it, and what the changeover of people would be. So all of that work is done, and if Parliament is sensible, can't believe I'm saying this, but if Parliament has any sense, they would take the work that's already been done. All the detail is there. You can just Google voice design principles. It'll pop up for you in Google, no problem, and you'll see very simple outline. And then in 10 or 15 years, Parliament will change, we'll all change, the nature of what the voices work or need or obligations or necessities will change, and a Parliament will come back again and say, we need to do a new consultation. We need to find out what the voice should be now. It shouldn't have 24 people, it should have 48 people, or something else. So all of that detail needs to come according to what Parliament of the day requires and what the people and the situation of the day requires. And I think it would... I think it's a really big mistake to try and insert that detail here, but I also think the request for detail or the expectation that we should have detail is probably a false request, and in fact it's just another one of the arguments that's been put to us to make us feel uncertain about something.
Yeah, definitely just adding to the unnecessary confusion. Noel, another concern is that there are a lot of people who want to support First Nations aspirations and empowerment, but then they're disheartened or confused by First Nations people who are against the voice. It's quite a vocal minority. Can you please explain these differing views, and how should we engage in discussions with those people who may want to vote no because of this vocal minority?
There's no such thing as a progressive no. There's just no. You know, same value as Hanson's no. And so it'd be utterly foolish to think that you're doing something other than agreeing with Senator Hanson and all of the no proponents when you vote no as a so-called progressive no. Fact is that we've been tracking Indigenous support for the voice for about 5 years. It's always been plus 80%. The media thrust microphones in front of random Indigenous people. If you thrust a microphone randomly in front of one of my brothers, you wouldn't get much of a response. They're kind of leaving it to Noel. Yeah, they'd rather be going fishing. Not everybody is engaged in current affairs and politics and policies and leadership and everything else. We're like everybody else. But what our pollsters tell us is that when they ask Indigenous people who are not familiar with the proposal, when they explain it to them, those Indigenous people say yes, immediately on board. Completely understandable. The levels of support are between 80 and 86% in the polls. There's a far right minority that are against it, and there's a far left minority that are against it. One mob say it's too much. The people on the right are saying, oh, that's giving Indigenous people too much. And the other side, the left, are saying it's not giving enough. I think the balance is right. This is a just proposal. This is a substantive proposal. But it is not a wild proposal from the left. It's extremely realistic. It is completely appropriate for the Constitution. Those words, by the way, in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first peoples of Australia, they are very simple words, but they're very profound. And they're profound because of the place in which we're going to put those words. The Constitution is a heavy-duty document. And so those simple words have a weight that belie the simplicity of the words. So I think we got the balance right with these 72 or 92. I can't remember. With these 72 words, we've got the balance right.
I'll just add something that that maybe I can add that you can't add, and that is we don't expect any other community group in Australia to have 99% approval rating for anything that gets done. And the thought of the Jewish community agreeing at 80 to 86% of the community agreeing on anything, even where we would put a road crossing well, the Jewish News would be out of business if we all had such unanimity. So, whilst having support of Aboriginal people is of course important, and this has come from the Uluru Statement, and it's an invitation to us, so it is come from Aboriginal people to Australia, to Australians generally. It's a false requirement to require everybody, to the last person, to say, yes, I'm signing on for this. Yep.
I think we've just got to remember that we have a government. And the government has all the say in relation to our comings and going, what we can do, what we can't do. And guess what? That government is there with a two-party preferred vote of something like 52 to 48. 80% is humongous. It is absolutely, it's a huge majority. And the fact is, when you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of people, and I think here in this case we're dealing with almost 1 million people, Indigenous peoples of Australia, I mean, the idea that you're not going to have, some opposition, it's ridiculous. I mean, that's not consistent with what human beings are like. The only thing I would say is what I'm not going to say is because I don't think it would be productive to point out why I think some of the more prominent Indigenous naysayers are naysayers. But maybe if you think about it long enough, you'll work that out for yourselves.
And Melissa, just to your point about our own community, and we're not all expected to agree, but we also have our own representative bodies like the JCCV and ECAD who are expected to make representations on behalf of, all of us that I'm sure agree. Mark, over to you again. There's a lot of concern about the power the voice might have and what kind of matters it can start advising on. Can you talk further to your understanding of what powers the voice will have and what they'll be advising on?
In order to answer that question, you've got to get back to what is the power of the voice altogether. The voice doesn't confer any rights on Indigenous peoples that are not available to everyone in society. It is a voice and it's got the power to it may make representations. But you know what? Every person sitting in this room has got the voice to make representations to government. We can all do it. Every one of us can do it. So when people start talking about divisiveness and special powers, it's a complete nonsense to begin with. Now, it's true that this voice, this new body, will be able to make representations in relation to anything and everything. But equally, the executive and the parliament, if it is not happy with these representations, can totally ignore them. So, if the representations start focusing on, the Reserve Bank, well, I mean, I think Noel, I heard Noel actually pointing this out. I mean, if this referendum goes through, it places a huge onus on Indigenous peoples because they're going to have a representative body and it's going to be making representations about matters inherently impacting on Indigenous peoples like employment, health and so on and so forth. And if it starts dealing with irrelevant matters, it won't be taken seriously. The whole thing will turn out to be, frankly, an irrelevant joke. It'll be very sad. That's not what's going to happen. And I don't believe anyone in their right mind could conceivably believe that that's what is going to happen. Now, if the body had the right to give instructions to the Parliament or to the Executive in relation to how the Reserve Bank is going to be run, then that would be a legitimate cause for concern, but it doesn't have that power. It has no more than the power to give advice, and if it's got half a brain, and if there are people like Noel sitting there, it's going to have much more than a half a brain, then fundamentally what it's going to be dealing with is matters which go to the heart of the welfare of Indigenous peoples.
And just following on from what you said, you touched on relevant versus irrelevant. And earlier we spoke about the detail, but Noel, I think it would be really wonderful to hear from you. What are some of the practical outcomes that, First Nations people are hoping for if the voice is successful?
Well, you know, the usual things that humans need to prosper. Housing, education, health, justice, income, jobs. These are the things we need to address. I have been giving the example of a particular disease that affects remote communities called rheumatic heart disease. It only exists in places like India and Bangladesh, but it also exists in remote communities in Australia. It's a fever you have as a child, as a baby or a toddler, and then your heart is forever compromised. And we just get people in their teens or 20s or 30s randomly dying. And it turns out they're all victims of rheumatic heart disease. Now, it's possible to eradicate RHD. It's been eradicated in Australia successfully. But it requires a full court press by government and communities working together to tackle this horrendous disease. Now, I got my team in Cairns to research whether our local member, who's been our member for 26 years, as to whether he's ever spoken to the Parliament about RHD. And they searched and found not one reference in 26 years representing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in his own electorate. He gave his first speech on the subject the week after I raised it. These are the issues that the Voice needs to bring to the fore, to the Parliament and the executive government, that we can't continue to do nothing about a disease that has been eradicated throughout the world by governments and communities that have made concerted efforts to tackle the problem. There's a big range of issues and Parliament's, I can tell you, I mean, I've crashed through with some solutions over the years and gotten government's attention and support. But that is hard yakka, and not everything I've ever wanted to do is I've had the ability to get focus on. If you're in the business I'm in, you're trying to change things from the outside, you've got 90% of the knowledge and 10% of the power. And you're dealing with bureaucrats and politicians that are the reverse. They've got 90% of the power and 10% of the knowledge. So you have a lot of fights. And you win some fights, but the enemies you create as well doesn't. So the solutions are going to be more systematic. They can't just be because we've run a hard campaign and we've managed to convince the government to do something. Too many issues remain unaddressed. And with the Voice, we'll have a much more systematic. And the democracy is a competitive place. How do you get your issues to the front of the queue? You know, there's a whole lot of other people wanting attention and wanting their issues and wanting laws passed on behalf of their issues. And to get an Indigenous issue into the queue is not easy. So this is where the Voice will have this very, very great advantage for us in terms of competing in Canberra for attention and for notice and for support. It's going to make our participation in the democracy that much more effective. Because I can tell you countless issues that we've been I've been waiting for an opportunity for many, many years to run with it because I can see an opening. You But some of these issues have been sitting on the back burner for too long. Whereas with a voice, the voice will be agitating for attention, as it should, right? In a democracy, as it should. And so I think those are going to be the practical benefits. We're going to be able to bring these social and economic issues to the fore in Canberra and come up with better solutions. The reason why we're not closing the gap, the solutions aren't very good. We need better solutions coming from the community and other players from other sources. I think that's going to be the exciting thing about the voice. We're finally going to try. How do you tackle poverty? No easy answers. But I see some exciting ideas about how you could do that. And so I see the voice as really, we're going to go into an era when we're going to allow more innovation and exciting and different approaches rather than just the old service delivery, social policy stuff that doesn't turn the dial.
I love the excitement. I love hearing about how ready to tackle these big issues head on. And it certainly, to me, sounds practical and specific and definitely not irrelevant. I'm about to open up to audience questions, so hope a couple of you are ready. We'll have some time for a few questions, but just one more question to Melissa before we do that. There's a lot of question about race and why should one group of people have an enshrined voice in the Constitution? Are these fair and accurate claims?
No.
Good answer.
But the Constitution was designed at a time over 100 years ago that was deeply embedded in social racism, and the exclusion that occurred at the time when those founding fathers drafted that Constitution was built into the document. And there's actually specific provisions that talk about Aboriginal people, they mean Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So the Constitution already engages in treating part of the community in a different way than other people are treated. That's how it was designed back then, before 1901. It's what we had to deal with in 1967, but weren't able to properly complete that task. And it's what we're now having to address today. But the call that it's bringing race into the Constitution, or it's making divisions on race, is a false call, because there already is racist and race-based concepts in the Constitution, which we try and ameliorate and try and not engage on that level. And the Parliament, the federal Parliament itself, can make laws about Aboriginal people without having any interest or attention to what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people need those laws to be about, because of that structural framing already. So we need to be able to address the needs and the aspirations and the inclusion of Aboriginal people moving forward, not as a matter of race, not as a matter of racism, but as a matter of inclusion and recognition. So I'm taking this in a very forward-looking view, not the backwards, old-fashioned and disrespected views, but looking forward. And so the question itself is, again, another one of these kind of derailing things that is designed to make us feel worried that something strange is going to happen. The strange thing already happened a long time ago. We're trying to fix that.
And I think that's the point. There's a lot of things that are just trying to derail people. So at that point, we've got some time for some questions. I'm just going to ask that you keep the questions really